Welcome back to Restorative Justice Reflections, the show where we analyze what's happening in news, media, pop culture, and ask restorative questions to help us make sense of it all. I'm David Castro Harris, and I'm here again with Kala Mendoza to take a deep dive into the themes of HBO's The Last of Us, Episode 7, Left Behind. As always, the thoughts reflected here are not a critique of the story choices or production choices of the creators, but we hope to make connections between the themes present in this story where we can co-create a world where people and communities have what they need to survive and thrive. If you want to learn more about how to do restorative justice work or get connected with mutual protection work, links to do that are in the show notes, but let's get to it. Spoiler alert for everyone listening. For this first part of our conversation, everything that's happened in the HBO show, The Last of Us, through episode 7 is fair game. You've been warned. And we will talk about things that happen in the greater scope of The Last of Us universe at the end of this episode, but we will give you plenty of warning before we get there. So episode 7, this is representation of the DLC, the downloadable content left behind from the Last of Us video game, gives us a little bit more background into Ellie's story. Kala, how did this land with you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really great kind of like pause moment, I guess, in the plot for us to see the a flashback of who Ellie is and what are the experience that she had gone through in order to inform how she moves in the world. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, it's always like this episode like really didn't advance the plot a lot more forward, right? It was just Ellie making a decision whether to leave or go back to help Joel, but like knowing all that about her history is so important. And I think, something that we learn from all shows that we watch, or many shows that we watch, much of the media we consume, is you never know what's going on for someone as they're making their day-to-day choices, all the things that have happened in their past that have informed the decision that they're going to make in a given moment. Whether it's like the fight that they had with their partner in the morning before they got to your workplace, whether or not they're properly caffeinated, or whether it was something that like traumatically happened in their history, right? People are making choices not just based off of the information that you see in front of you, but all the things that have happened before, right? And we can even think about, in Ellie's case, right, her Fedra training, the way that she grew up in school, the way that she was socialized as a young person who was parentless and conscripted into Fedra military school from the jump, that had a huge impact on how she sees the world and how she navigates the world, what she values, right? We saw a lot of representation of a lot of what schools look like right now, right? Bullies, mean girls, people forcing you to be in places and do things that may or may not be what you're most interested in. What were you thinking as we were seeing Ellie go through, a typical high school, middle school experience in the post-apocalypse?
Yeah, it's really interesting how the same indoctrination that happens in Fedra schools happens within our own schools, right? I think for a lot of folks, I know in the Bay Area, we had a ROTC program. We were very much like going to the military. This is how you're going to pay for college. So seeing that much more blatantly in a fascist world order, it was a little bit scary about how many parallels there are, but also that bullying, unfortunately, seems to be a never-ending problem. Regardless of whether we're in pre-apocalypse or post-apocalypse. Yeah.
Right. And when we think about the root causes of that insecurity not being fulfilled or not being recognized in the ways that you want to be recognized, are the reasons that Bethany, Riley, Ellie are adopts not having healthy ways to deal with anger or express those feelings is a way that we can definitely start to or finding ways to address those feelings of anger, insecurity, fear is a lot more healthy way to do that. And if you want to think about the ways that you can get involved with restorative justice in education spaces, again, links in the description. Also, when you're speaking to, the caring adults in a space, I think you can make an argument that Captain Kwong was somebody who demonstrated some level of compassion in that space as the maybe principal, headmaster, drill sergeant, or whatever you want to call him in that space where he did show compassion. And, we kind of do see like the both sides of Fedra versus the Fireflies. Fedra saying like, hey, we're providing safety because safety and security. And we've talked about that on previous episodes, the difference between like enforcing security where it's instead of generating safety from a community perspective. But when we think about, Fedra is providing like some kind of needs for a community so people can at least survive. And the Fireflies are looking for something a little bit more liberated, not necessarily using the healthiest means to get there. We can talk about that in a bit. But I think this is a parallel argument to the police state, right? Where you can have compassionate people people who demonstrate compassion in the roles of law enforcement, and the thing that they're perpetuating, the security state, at the expense of violence sanctioned by, in our case, the state, in Fedra's cases, I guess Fedra, having like really shitty consequences for everybody who lives under that, right? Both, of course, for the citizens who experience that violence. And while Boston might not be at the same level of police violence as what they talked about Kansas City being in episode, what was that? 4 and 5?
Yeah.
4 and 5. There are lots of ways that the people within the city of Boston, in the Boston QZ, have been harmed. And, Fedra officers not having the greatest life either, right? Thinking about the Fedra officer in the first episode who Joel was selling drugs to, right? Thinking about the life that Riley might have led as a Fedra officer, as a Fedra security person, supervising people shovel shit, right? Or supervise people burning bodies, right? That takes a toll on people too. And so like when we're thinking about compassionately building these oppressive structures, it's great that there's compassion, but like, what if we imagine something different? And I think that's what the Fireflies are doing. And Captain Kwong just doesn't see that.
Yeah, I think that that's the issue with fascist states, right? There were nice Nazis, right? There was this one image I recall of a group of, I think that they were Hitler Youth. They were just like having fun in the park. It's what it looked like, but they were in Auschwitz. And I think that you can uphold an oppressive system and benefit from it and still be, you can still consider yourself a nice person. But do we need nice people, or do we need people who care about the collective well-being that isn't just in a state of survival mode, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I think about a framework that's come up a lot in the show of like endure and survive, right? What comes to mind for me is like, conform and survive, right? And it's not about thriving. It's about like, what is the thing that we need to do to get to the next day? And like, we definitely understand, and I'll speak for both of us, like we definitely understand like the day-to-day choices that people make that are upholding systems of white supremacy, domination, and patriarchy, right? We all participate in those systems, and it is our everyday choice to decide like, when we're going to betray the system or not, right? We both pay cell phone bills, right? And the cell phone companies of choice, right, spend part of what they do, send part of their revenue on like helping build satellites that are used for drone strikes, right? We both pay taxes, right? And so much of our both local and federal taxes are to operate the U.S. Military industrial complex, which neither of us are okay with on like a moral level, and we still do it, right? What are the active steps that we're doing to betray the system? Like for some of us, it might look like allocating resources that we get from our jobs or whatever streams of revenue that we have to people, to communities, to causes that we care about. It might look like how we're spending our time on the day to day. It might look like having those moment to moment conversations with colleagues, friends, relatives about life being a different way. But in a lot of ways, we are trapped being, some version of a compassionate Captain Kwong.
Yes, I think, we are trapped in a system, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't etch away at the corners, right? I think what we've seen in the last 20 years with groups that have really been thinking about doing more local work, whether it's like mutual aid support groups, folks building out pods, folks sharing prepper tips or whatever. We're trying to reimagine and also work towards a world in our day-to-day that is outside of the grasp of capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism. Because I think if we don't do that, then we can divert into Kansas City. If we are able to infuse our everyday practice with theory rooted in liberation, Black and Indigenous feminism, decolonization, I think that's one way that we can resist in this living nightmare that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we started recording, you had mentioned that, representation isn't everything. And I think Captain Kwong is a good reason why, right? Captain Kwong, I believe, is the only named character of Asian descent other than the people in Indonesia, where the outbreak might have started. And, both of us being Filipino, right? We are not Chinese, Kwong being a Chinese last name. But when we think about, the ways that someone in that position had to or chose to assimilate, chose to conform, to survive, to make the best if he could with this world, I think about the ways that that might have been harmful for him as an individual, but also not absolving him of, and we don't know this is what happens, right? But, you take the Black character in this situation, we know that she did not fit in well within Fedra schooling, but how much of that anti-Blackness was baked into, of course, Fedra curriculum and procedures, but even as an Asian person, seeing a strong Black woman as a problem, right? And say we're going to just put you over there, and having to not having to deal with you and not having to deal with your opinions and the ways that you want to reimagine the world, supervise people on trash duty. And that's that. We can't escape those things I can't escape those things as a viewer, even when we're looking at a fantasy world.
Yeah, we definitely can't escape those things as we look at a fantasy or sci-fi world, because that's it. These narratives are informed by the realities that we find ourselves in. But I think it's also an invitation to us as the audience to reimagine not being complicit and not being an accomplice to a system of oppression. What does it look like to resist? What does it look like to resist beautifully, and not just in ways that involve the tactics that the Fireflies use? So, yeah, these are all the things that kind of in the pale moments of the show that I like to kind of think about and ask myself.
Yeah, when you think about resisting fascistic oppressive forces in pop culture or in sci-fi world or nerd culture, right? The thing that most often comes up in my mind is the Empire, the Galactic Empire, or the First Order in Star Wars. And you and I are both super fans and excited for The Mandalorian coming out tomorrow as of the day of this recording. But before we were recording, you and I were talking about the role of people who have betrayed the Empire in many different situations. So in the last trilogy, General Hux, both out of self-interest and self-preservation, but also seeing the way that Kylo Ren was leading the First Order, was no longer aligning with his values, fed information to the rebels, right? When we think about the animated show Rebels, we think about Agent Kallus. I guess this is a major spoiler alert for those who haven't engaged in Rebels, so apologies. But Kallus ends up being an agent for the Rebel Alliance, or the newly formed Rebel Alliance, betraying the Empire, using his officer status. And so when we think about the pathways that Kwong is putting in front of Ellie, is you could be a grunt and have a really hard life, or you could be an officer, in whatever you choose to do with your role as an officer. It could be different. People I know who have chosen a life of safety, security, that comes with, six-figure jobs, with multiple six-figure jobs within corporate, within other industries that are not necessarily about the liberation of our people, that can feel like golden handcuffs. You can feel trapped, even though you go in with these ideals, saying that I can make these changes. those changes are really hard to make in these systems that are set up. And, arguably, Fedra being a less than 20-year-old institution might be on some shakier ground and like more apt to change. But, where's Ellie getting her radical political education in order to be conscious of making those changes? That's not what gets presented to us in the show, but like those are the things that young people making career choices, people who are my age or older, your age, right, are constantly making about, am I going to continue to keep the safety and security or like the predictability of these conditions that I've built to sustain a life for myself? Or are we going to do something different? And this isn't an argument for people to, quit your jobs and live in a commune, right? That's not necessarily an argument for that, right? But like, what are the trade-offs that we're making? Let's make those trade-offs consciously.
Yeah. I mean, definitely not telling folks to join a commune or, start going that direction. But I think, how can we think more collectivistically? Like, how can folks do what you're inviting them to do? I mean, like, most folks can't go into a commune. But I think people do recognize very intrinsically that we are all interconnected, that our lives and the lives of everyone on this planet is interconnected. How do we reinforce that in our day-to-day practice, in the way that we live our lives? Because I think subscribing to the white settler colonial myth of individuality, that the individual is all that matters, has brought us to this crisis point now. So I think it's like really getting folks to think about, how do we support one another in the ways that we can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. And I think, Riley plays a really interesting role in this where, we're dealing with teenagers, right? A 17-year-old and 14-year-old who are, best friends. Like Riley might not have the mentality of like, I'm going back to Ellie so I can like recruit her to the Fireflies. She says that's not her intention, and it doesn't seem like that's actually her intention, right? She's just wanting to really say goodbye to her friend, but like what she does is open up Ellie to a new way, a different way, right? Even though that there are, violent trade-offs, right? That you might have to make in order to be a different way, learn a different way. Those conscious choices of caring for people who you are in relationship with and allowing them to know what's going on with you is really important. And it happened at great risk to both of them, right? And again, most of us don't live in conditions where we have to risk our lives in order to have those type of conversations. But it does come with emotional risk sometime, right? We can feel like we are risking relationships to have conversations with folks who we perceive to have different values or different beliefs about the world. I'm not saying that we should turn every interaction we have with those people into moments to like proselytize about like mutual protection, collective liberation, interconnection, restorative justice, etc. Right? But like, strategically thinking about the opportunities to invite people into experiences or conversations that might help them see the world a little bit differently. And right, so much of what that can look like is through play, right? So much of what Riley introduced to Ellie, like very intentionally, was about like, hey, like this is a really amazing experience. I know you, I thought of you, and this is the world that I want to live in. We can get things back to where they were before, maybe through Firefly ideology, not necessarily ascribing to Fedra. I might be reading too much into what 17-year-old Riley, marvelously played by Storm Reed, was thinking, but like those were the things that were spinning in my head.
Yeah, I mean, this show, I had some different thoughts, primarily because the show is one of the most queer shows about the post-apocalyptic world. And I can pretty much guarantee you that every single queer person that has watched the the 4 Wonders of the World date that Riley had organized, like how many of us have done that in our own lives? In that moment, in that moment in our lives when we may not be either out to ourselves or others, but we want to show such deep love and appreciation and care for someone. We may not be able to articulate it because of the internalized hate that we have had to absorb, but we will go above and beyond to do that. So yeah, it was, I was just having flashbacks of myself as a baby queer, going up way extra for my unavailable straight friends who I was in love with. But in this moment in time, when gay marriage hadn't passed, they're living in an apocalypse.
Right.
I wonder, what have they been missing, either growing up or within the federal education system, where they're not able to communicate, right? Where they're not able to speak their truth to one another and to really share that. Yeah, what's your take?
Yeah, well, because this happened, the outbreak happened in 2003. That means Riley was born in 2006. Ellie was born in 2009. Lots of things within the queer liberation, or I'll call it queer acceptance, tolerance for where we are in our country, movement has progressed to. And sad as it is to say, when you're thinking about fighting infected and getting food and water and electricity and all these things, right? Sanitation, right? Those things aren't necessarily front of mind to the greater public. That might mean that people just don't care anymore, right? It's just whatever, as long as we're surviving, love is love. It might mean that, but I imagine because of the ways that they both seemed to feel repressed or insecure or closeted for some reason, right? That might not have been the case. What kind of comprehensive sex ed was happening in Fedra military school? Probably not a lot, right? And no, it's just funny to think about all the things that have been missed, right, through media representation. And both you and I are representation is important. Representation isn't everything, right? There's a lot of media over the past 20 years that would not have existed for these two people to make connections oh, these are the feelings that I'm feeling, and this is normal, this is okay, this is acceptable. I can be who I am out in this world. I mean, and then the other part of that is 14 and 17-year-olds just trying to figure out dynamics between each other. Was there anything else that you had on the date?
No, it was just adorable. I mean, there's nothing, I don't have an in-depth take necessarily, but it's, it's just heartening to know that, even in apocalyptic times, we are hardwired to show love and care for one another, and how beautiful that was in the short time that it was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we get to the end of this date where Riley tells Ellie that, she's leaving to join the Fireflies. Ellie gets really, really upset, walks away, but ends up coming back. They do make up, share a kiss. Riley, in a moment, has agreed not to go, and they would figure out what comes next. But their joy, elation, newfound love, and acceptance of each other is cut short by an attack by a runner, right, who had been living in the mall. And we can question the Fireflies' tactics of, leaving a teenager in a obviously not thoroughly inspected mall. But what happens is Ellie ends up killing the runner, but both of them are bitten. And, I think the major difference between Ellie and Riley in this world is that Riley grew up with a family and lost that family. Ellie has never really known her family. And so when we see Riley's response of just being sullen, reserved, and sad, we see Ellie raging because this might be one of the first times that she's experienced loss on this magnitude. As this was happening, knowing that Ellie survives and Riley doesn't, and that's not a spoiler because we've watched the show and Riley's not present. What was coming up for you as you watched their two reactions to their now sealed fates or perceived sealed fates?
I mean, it just once again showed how I don't want to be Riley was so much more emotionally mature, but I think the way that they were processing mortality, right? They're processing the inevitability and already kind of thinking through like, here are the options that we have. I think that was all happening in those few moments. And Ellie was clear that Ellie didn't have that support network that helped to kind of like foster that sense of, I don't want to say acceptance, but to be able to process things. And there's no judgment, right? Like, if you need to break stuff because like you're feeling this rage that you got bit by a, infected, do what you got to do. And also, it's just like an interesting juxtaposition between their two responses. And how do we respond in times of crisis, right? What are the resources, capacities, and lived experiences that we have to support us in coming up with our path forward? So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Even in this case where like there is no like problem solving to save themselves, right? Like there's no cure to get, right? Like what's done is done. And right, the options that they have are take the easy way out, suicide, Riley has a gun, or to, wait to see what happens, lose their minds together, right? In the way that the infection takes over their bodies seem to be their two options. We know that like the third option is live, like wait to see what happens and find out if one of us is immune, which ends up happening. But yeah, I just wanted to go back to what you said a second ago, where it's like, and it's not even necessarily a reflection on Riley's age or maturity, that like that's how she chooses to process, right? But when we're in those moments, what are the ways that we can move to acknowledge, process, move through, or hold space for the emotions that we had? At the beginning of us recording together for this series, you and I, and many people in the Asian diaspora were in an intense moment of grief, right? Where we just experienced another act of violence within our community, or two acts of violence within our community, right? And, there are lots of episodes in this feed about, grief space and like the importance of doing, like holding space for that, not moving past emotion so quickly into problem solving mode. But, when you have maybe 2 hours or 2 days till infection takes over, your calculations about like what you're going to do is going to be different. Mm-hmm. And, I love what Riley says, right? Two options, easy way out, or we keep going, right? And Ellie comes back with like, what are you talking about, Riley? It's over. And Riley comes back with, it will be, right? But not yet. It ends this way for everyone sooner or later, right? Some of us just get there faster than others, but we don't quit. That was definitely the line of the episode for me, because while neither you or I are bitten by mushroom zombies, right? We are living on borrowed time, right? All humans are going to die. We're living in suboptimal conditions. When I was thinking about this, I was reminded of the words of, one of the leaders of the Black Panthers, Huey P. Newton, in his book Revolutionary Suicide, when he said, the first lesson a revolutionary must learn is that he's a doomed man, and not in a morbid way, right? But he was thinking about like, we have finite time, we have finite resources, we are up against forces that are not for us, right? That are actively trying to suppress the ways that we're trying to live, the world that we want to manifest. So what are you going to do with your time, right? And again, you and I are not dying in the next 2 hours or 2 days and being taken over by a mushroom fungal infection, but we are working in a world where there's a lot that we have to do to build the world that we want to see, and we have finite resources, we have finite time. How do you move knowing that you're a doomed person?
One thing I learned early on is by accepting the fact that all compounded things decay, everything passes, basically meditating upon the fact that, everything is impermanent. There is almost like a sense of freedom to be able to say, like, what do I want to do, right? With the time that I have. I may not have the quantity of all the time in the world, but I can make it quality. And I think it goes back to kind of those choice points that are deprived from us by systems of oppression. when we're able to make choices about how we live our lives, how we don't just survive, but how we thrive, right? I think that's kind of what I feel like many revolutionaries and thinkers since time immemorial have invited us to do with the limited time that we have.
Yeah. This is a spoiler. Like, you can just like skip forward 15, 30 seconds if you don't want to hear this, right? Fedra and the Fireflies don't last forever in this world, right? And so, end of spoiler. When we think about making change, right, it's not necessarily that we're relying on institutions or organizations to make that change, right? I think about the words of Miriam Kaba when she talks about, hope being a discipline, right? Not necessarily relying on institutions or the organizations that we're creating or a part of to like be the end all be all of our movement work, but, staying faithful to our principles and our values, knowing that generations to come will feel the effects. And of course, thinking about, the principle of 7 generations from indigenous people across the world, specifically from the Haudenosaunee, and in this case, thinking about the lessons and wisdom learned from people 3 generations before us to make decisions that will benefit people 3 generations to come, right, is really important when we're thinking about how we're spending our time, how we're allocating resources, not just for what is going to benefit us today, tomorrow, the next year, the next 10 years, right? But what is setting us up for long-term success, even if it's like beyond like the memory of the name David, beyond the memory of the name Kala, right? We have so much that we can contribute, and simultaneously holding like, how are we taking care of ourselves in the process? So, we're not burning out, spending every waking moment doing organizing work, right? Doing radical political education, not doing citizen protection at protests, right? Like, doing that 24 hours isn't the thing to do either, right? But it is an invitation to make, again, really intentional, conscious choices about how to allocate time and resources and who to build with beyond organizations, right? Fedra, Fireflies, both out for protection of people. But, who do you organize with? Who are the people? Who are the people who are values aligned with you that will help build the world that you want to live in? This episode is bookended right at the beginning and end by Ellie in this abandoned house that she's taken Joel to, right? So at the beginning, she's making the choice whether to leave or stay with Joel to save herself or to, try to get Joel better. And at the end of this episode, she makes the choice to forego trying to go back to Tommy for safety and figure out what she can do to help Joel in that moment. And, again, plot-wise, this was something that happened probably within minutes, but like it was backed up by this knowledge of Riley's words, like, that we don't give up. I don't want to give up, right? We don't quit on the things that are important to us. We don't quit on the things that we love. And so she does make the choice to, against Joel's wishes, against Joel's like telling her, take the gun, go back to Tommy, to, find some unsanitary medical equipment and do do amateur surgery on Joel to do her best to help him survive. I think this like leads us to Kala's prepper corner when we're thinking about like, what we do in circumstances of crisis. How do we ask for help? How do we respond? So take it away.
Yeah, so this is really inspired by a practice that a dear friend, colleague, and comrade Robin Ayers really taught me. And this has been something that I've used, in some form or another, but really in like the last few years, is one when we are offering support, it's important for us to be able to do a self-assessment to see what our capacity is. Following that, trying to figure out what can you do to actually support? What are the things? Because like the last thing you want to do is to put the onus or the burden on the person of the community asking for support to be like, oh, hey, what do you need? they may not be in that space, but by assessing, okay, so I have the capacity to hold space for someone. I have the capacity to, buy them dinner. I have the capacity to take care of their kids for the weekend, whatever it is, to be able to have that and to offer that to those who have been directly affected by violence or who are going through a crisis moment. And I think Ellie had done this in the show. Right after making the decision to stay with Joel, it's like, okay, so what can I do? They probably had some basic first aid training, so that's what their offering was. So by doing an assessment, if we want to be someone that offers support in a collectivistic way, reinforcing someone's agency and autonomy, it's really important that we do that self-assessment to identify our capacities, resources, and what our offerings are, and then to offer those to those that need it and those that have asked for it. Otherwise, we continue to put the burden on them. And I think the more we get into this practice, the easier it is for us to articulate and to make it very clear to others, like, how do we show true community care when it isn't like offhanded, like, how are you? It's so loaded, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, what this requires, right, is a couple things, right? When we think about restorative justice being about relationship, the first relationship that you have is the relationship with yourself. So, again, proactively, how are you taking care of yourself so, like, you are able to be functioning on the highest level that you can, be of the most service that you can, also because you just deserve it and you're a person worthy of self-love and self-care. But like in those moments of crisis, like it's the whole, like, make sure that your cup is filled before you're going to like pour into others, or, put your oxygen mask on before you're taking care of other people. And everybody makes those calculations on a day-to-day. I think there's a myth of balance that, like, spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, like you can get to a place where like you're at 100 with all of those. I don't think that's realistic. It might be if you reached, enlightenment in that sense, holla at your boy, right? But, taking the moment to like self-assess about like, what can I do with the limited capacity that I have with everything not being at 100 is really important, right? Are my knowledge and skills best suited for addressing this problem? Maybe not. Maybe it should be someone else. Even if you are like firing on all cylinders, you might not be the person to handle that particular situation. The other thing that it brings to mind, though, is when we're thinking about, who are the people that we're reaching out to? What are the conversations that we can proactively have with them about, like, when this happens, this is what I need from you, right? When this happens, this is what I can do to support you, right? We don't have those conversations very often. And it makes the process of responding to crises, to violence, to trauma in whatever way, shape, or form, right? A lot easier if we've had those conversations proactively. Even if like we don't follow the plan to a T, right? At least we have a framework for how we can be together rather than just trying to figure it out on the fly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, how many times have listeners to this show, we have gone through a collective moment of grief, moment of pain, and we have well-intentioned folks reaching out and being like, hey, how are you doing? What can I do to support? I think the more that we can help support folks into really making these frameworks as widespread as possible, the healthier our communities are going to be, because the reality is we're not going to be seeing a reprieve from the violence that we have been experiencing for all the centuries that our communities have been in this country. So how can we now proactively really look out and cultivate and build that community care and incorporate this collectivistic approach into our day-to-day practice? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Like super, super practically, right? What are the conversations that Joel and Ellie had about like, hey, if I get shot, if I get stabbed, if I get bit, what are we going to do? Seems like they didn't really have those conversations, right? And so like, if you think about like the intimate relationships that you have, right, with your partner, with your friends, with your close work colleagues, who like the people who you are spending the majority of your time with, like, what are the plans that you have for if and when things go wrong? right? You're not going to be bitten by mushroom zombies. You're probably not going to be shot by, raiders. But like, what are the things that might come up in your life that you should have plans about communicating about? Whether it is like California folks, earthquake preparedness, fires, all this, or the things in your day-to-day life about like, hey, I got a flat tire. Who's going to pick up my kid?
Yeah.
Those are conversations that we would often benefit from having proactively, so people don't feel like they have like expectations like flung on them in any given moment.
Definitely. I think you're inspiring me. Maybe in the next couple podcasts, I'll share how to do a threat assessment so folks can be able to identify likely threats and like move through that framework. So that way you can communicate it with your pod, with your family, and with the folks that are around you, who you built this community of care with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, there is definitely a major threat coming in the next episode. So we'll have plenty to go off of there. All right. So that concludes our not super spoiler conversation. We'll be back in this feed with another conversation with someone living this restorative justice life on Thursday of this week. And we'll be back either probably next Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, depending on our production schedule, with another episode reflecting on episode 8 of The Last of Us. But I wanted to share again that on March 19, we're still on for that, right? Yeah. On March 19, Kala and I are hosting an event, Freedom Dreaming, What a Thriving Community Looks Like. Links to that are in the show notes. So if you want to spend time with us and others who are really thinking about what building thriving community looks like, what are the things that we want, what is the intentionality that it takes to build those things, what are the obstacles that we might have to overcome, show notes are where you can find all the info to sign up. Any parting words, Kala, before we do super spoilers?
Nope.
All right. Well, then, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's on you if anything that we say in the next couple minutes is spoiling the rest of the show for you. I wanted to really quickly revisit the fact that, by the time we get to game 2, like neither Fedra or the Fireflies are really around, right, as organizations, right? And so when we're thinking about security and safety, especially like when we're tying things to organizations, like thinking about how fragile those things are. Like we live in the United States where our government as we've known it has existed for 200 plus years in some way, shape, or form. And empires rise and fall.
Yeah.
Right? Like arguably the United States is on its downward spiral, right? Or on a downward trajectory, right? There have been revolutionary movements over the years with attempts to overthrow or like overpower the U.S. government, specifically thinking about the Civil War, but also like lots of other upstart militia attempts to topple powers like that haven't had staying power, but their ideals have hung on for a long time, right? And so like when we're thinking about ideals of movements like existing beyond like a specific organization, I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, right? Both for good and bad. And like you and I are making like moralistic judgments about like whether the Confederacy was like good or bad, but like also like people can make moralistic judgments about like whether like the Black Panther Party, right, while like it still exists in some way, shape, or form, like isn't what it was in the 60s, right? And those ideas have continued to like permeate the culture. And so like when we're thinking about, hope being a discipline, right, building the world for future generations, staying aligned with your values beyond like a specific organization, right? Amplify RJ, Nonviolent Peace Force, right? Like these are just frameworks that in some way exist to like employ people to like do work that is rooted in these values. And like, that's what's the most important. Yeah. I'm wondering if there's anything there that like specifically speaks to you.
Yeah. I mean, like the kind of the centerpiece of our work is around unarmed civilian protection. Basically using nonviolent strategies to protect protect communities, deter violence, and build lasting peace. We as an organization, we don't own unarmed civilian protection as a concept. Like, that's something that's been practiced by our communities since time immemorial. I think that the importance of organizations is really being containers for it, and for containers for these concepts. So I think when folks are trying to think about, like, how do I get involved? What can I do? Really look at it. Look at organizations as those containers. But as David was saying, being able to find organizations that you are aligned with in terms of values, in terms of not just intention, but also impact is extremely important, right? Because, like, I'm not sure, but Fedra probably had a nice intention in the beginning to protect folks, but look at the negative impact on communities. So, yeah.
Yeah, even thinking about, the wolves and scars, right? So, like, the Washington Liberation Front in the second game, which is, like, in some ways, like, a mix of the Fireflies and Fedra when it comes down to it, right? Fedra collapsed, but people who were Fireflies also joined this organization for, like, security and safety. And what did they end up doing? Like, creating, like, a pretty Fedra type organization, right? And, the Scars, as they're pejoratively called, or, like, the Seraphites, who were, like, the followers of this one seemingly enlightened prophet, right, who was looking for, like, a way to, I guess, return the world to the way that it was through, like, purity and, like, repenting of sins. And, like, well, I think, like, that person might have had good intentions. Like, the ways that she and, like, then her followers corrupted, like, her message and her vision, right, led to, like, a lot of harm for a lot of people within, like, nonprofit world. And I think even within the context of corporate space, like, the idea of mission drift exists. And I think, like, knowing the difference between mission drift and, like, adapting to the times and adapting to context is really important. But I'm not sure of a way to, like, fully delineate between those two things. I don't think I'm in a position to do that with Amplify RJ as the founder, right? But also, like, when I, like, look at the different organizations that I see and, like, could maybe be critical of when they're doing, like, quote unquote justice work, right? You don't know the context, and so, like, it's hard to ascribe, like, quote unquote mission drift to those things.
Yeah.
So I think that's all we got as far as super spoilers. Again, we'll be back in this feed. I'll be back in this feed with another episode of Someone Living This Restorative Justice Life. Really excited for that conversation. And we'll be back a week from now, debriefing The Last of Us episode 8. Only 2 more to go. Take care, y'all.
Be safe, y'all.